Hello, my friends. It is day 114, and today we're reading Psalms 43, 44, 45, 49, 84, 85, and Psalms 87. But before we get into our recap for today, I want to thank you for taking out a moment to check out this video, and hopefully you're enjoying the yearly Bible reading program and you're taking in everything you're reading and sharing what you're learning with all of the other members of this community. But if you have not yet accepted the invitation, please check out the description box below. And there you will find the link that will take you directly to the YouVersion Bible app, where you can join us each and every day reading the Bible and leaving feedback on the things we're learning and discovering. So hope you will take advantage of that, and hopefully you'll be blessed by the participation as much as we are blessed by your involvement in the group. So we're reading Psalms 43, 44, 45, 49, 84, 85, 87. We're back in the Psalms. Yesterday, we took a break from the books of Samuel and we went into the Chronicles. And so now we're looking at a few things that will help us understand just how the Psalms are helping people through their everyday issues. And a lot of what we're reading is written by David because we're technically in the part of the narrative that is most concerned with his life. And so I won't go through every psalm you all have read. I just want to pick out a few verses and a few things that stood out in these chapters that I found it to either be interesting or encouraging. So let's start with chapter 44. In chapter 44, we see that this is a psalm that was written by the descendants of Korah. And so we know this is probably a psalm that was used in some sort of Levitical order, which the Psalms of David may have been used as well in the Levitical order. But we understand that if it was written by the descendants of Korah, then obviously they wrote it for a particular purpose that pertains to perhaps the temple. That's just my speculation, but I think that would be obviously relevant for their lives and their work. And so one of the things I love about this passage is that if you look at verse 1 through verse 8, it talks about the things God did for the ancestors. Obviously, the ancestors had an incredible relationship with God. They saw God's miracles. They saw God's works. And then when you get to verse 9, it's like, but now we have been tossed aside. So you did all these things for our ancestors. You did all these things for our nation. But now as we live in this current moment, it seems as though we are no longer a part of the victory that our predecessors have experienced. And so from verse 9 down to verse 26, we see there's a bit of a petition, if you will, towards God or of God to intervene, to release them from some of the things that they are facing. And when you get to verse 23, this is a very direct, a very interesting cry to the Lord for help. Look at what it says. Wake up, O Lord. Why do you sleep? Get up. Do not reject us forever. Why do you look the other way? Why do you ignore our suffering and our oppression? We collapse in the dust, lying face down in the dirt. Rise up, help us, ransom us because of your unfailing love. On behalf of your mercy, just on the merit of your mercy, they're saying, why don't you do something about what we are experiencing? What I wanted to point out there is just how real and how personal, how intimate these prayers and these psalms are. These are not your little, decorated, disguised prayers with sacred verbiage and garb. They are talking to God as if He is their personal Lord, Savior, and Creator. Like He belongs to me, I belong to Him, and I need Him to help me. And another thing I love about these kinds of psalms is it actually highlights how concerned God is about everyday life. And so I always want to bring that up because that's so important for us to remember. Now, when you look at chapter 49, you see another psalm of the descendants of Korah. And again, as we see the operation of the Levites and the tabernacle at this particular point, which will eventually be the temple, we can understand, again, David's influence on the nation of Israel. Whereas before, we probably did not expect to see this kind of expression, maybe. But there's obviously some connection between the Psalms and the work of the temple. And I think we could possibly credit most of that to David because of what he does in implementing different worship expressions in the temple and just in the life of the nation of Israel. Now, in chapter 49, he says, first, there's an expectation for a sort of resurrection in verse 15. As for me, God will redeem my life. He will snatch me from the power of the grave. You see that there's this concept of resurrection in the Old Testament, which, by the way, was unfamiliar to the world of the Hebrew people, the ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean world. Of course, they believe, and maybe should I say, if you think about Egyptian concepts, there's obviously somewhat of an understanding of what we might call afterlife, but I think we need to reframe and think about that a little differently than what we might perceive it to be in a Judeo-Christian framework. But nevertheless, there were some ideas of what you might call what we might call an afterlife. But this idea of resurrection, which is more than just saying I believe in an afterlife. You could believe in afterlife incarnation or whatever the case is, but that's not necessarily resurrection. The idea that God, Israel's God, has the ability to return dead things back to life is a very unique and very Abrahamic view. And so when we see this in chapter 49, verse 15, where this psalm is expressing some thoughts and ideas about deliverance from the grave, we want to pay attention to those kinds of things. And we want to note that this is an early biblical idea, which is fully manifested in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And also as we read it in the New Testament. Now, another verse that I felt was very powerful was verse 20. People who boast of their wealth don't understand they will die just like animals. And so I often like to remind myself of that whenever I become very discouraged about what's in my bank account or what I have materially. Of course, we aspire to all sorts of success, both materially and spiritually, but we don't measure our position with God or our state of being blessed simply by what we possess materially. None of those things can help us in the overall existence that we all have in this world and then thereafter. So we want to always focus and prioritize those sorts of things. Chapter 84 was another good verse, another good chapter for me. Again, another Psalm of Korah. And this is what is said. And again, remember we said about Korah writing psalms appropriate to the temple, their work in the temple. Well, look at chapter 84, verse 10. A single day in your courts is better than 1,000 anywhere else. So you see this sort of value of being in the presence of God, but more so being in the temple of God, the tabernacle of God, which is where the presence of God is found. We get these similar ideas from David, who seemingly sees such a high value of just always being in God's presence, being with God. And so this psalm actually expresses an earlier sentiment that we've seen in other psalms written by David. And this is what this psalm says in verse 10. I would rather be a gatekeeper in the house of my God than to live the good life in the homes of the wicked. And so you see this sort of, anything that gets me in the presence of God will be better than the lavished lifestyle that is led and filled with evilness and wickedness in the world. Another point that he brings up in verse 11 is that the Lord will withhold no good thing from those who do what is right. So you see, there's a sense of expectation that God will lead in providence, prosperity, and protection. Those are the three P's that I often talk about. You see that kind of oozing out of this passage, if you will. And then another passage that I thought was really, really strong was chapter 85, where it says in verse 10, unfailing love and truth have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed. You see that this psalm is talking about the Lord pouring his blessings upon Israel. And you see this marriage between God's mercy, God's truth, God's righteousness, and God's peace. There's a collaborative work happening here. And many times we see those as opposite ends of the spectrum, whereas God can only be merciful at the expense of his truth, or God can only be truthful at the expense of his mercy. Or take it this way: God can only be just at the expense of his peace, or being peaceful, or giving peace. What we see in this passage is that all those things work together because they are all coming from God. And you don't seemingly get this kind of output in anything, no matter how hard we pursue it, in institutions, in other individuals, or in different laws and practices. None of those things have the ability to bring all four of these things together in the way that we receive it from God. And so I thought that was very powerful, and I think that's something we need to highlight often, because it is a distinguishing factor between God, his kingdom, and the other idols and their nations as they currently exist in the world that we're reading about. So, there are a few things that probably we could all comment on, but these things I thought were worth noting and mentioning, at least from my perspective, about what I got out of the text. But I would love to learn more about what you discovered. So please leave a comment in the comment box below. Make sure you make some remarks or share something in the YouVersion app if you're led. And I believe it will be a blessing to everyone who will witness it. But again, thank you for watching. Take care. God bless. And remember, live by the word.